Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 56 of the Alabama Liberal Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about everything because there's lots of great news, bad news, terrible news, mostly bad news, but it's President's Day, and that makes me wonder about the dearly departed absences of everyone's favorite presidential candidates, Deval Patrick and Michael Bennet. I know you're all probably devastated. You probably can't even hear what I'm saying over your own sobs and tears. These candidates were everyone's favorites, and I just can't believe that we're seeing them go. Michael Bennet, who stayed in the race longer than he had any rhyme or reason or rationale to, and Deval Patrick, who entered the race and then appeared to immediately regret it and wished he could leave 2 weeks later. He was like the guy who comes to a party and he knows he shouldn't be there. He's like, oh shit, I didn't know my ex-girlfriend was going to be here. But he can't leave really fast or he'll lose face. So he just kind of has to linger around and everything. So honestly, when he jumped out of the race, I think everybody was like, why did you even get into this? You clearly had no affinity for it, no passion for it. Andrew Yang is also out. Kind of applaud him for once for doing the right thing and ending his race rather than just continuing to collect money and drag it out and split the party even further. Of course, he's not a member of the party. A lot of different things have happened. I mean, there's been so many shocking events since our last episode. I mean, one incredible upset happened in the world of competition. And by that, I mean Parasite winning Best Picture at the Academy Awards for some fucking reason. And so I kind of want to talk about all the competition that happens in this country. You have the Super Bowl and the Grammys and the Oscars, all within about 3 or 4 weeks of each other. The New Hampshire primary, and then this summer there'll be the Olympics, and this fall there'll be the presidential race. We're a country that really loves to compete, and competition is everything. The best music at the Grammys, best film at the Academy Awards, even though I can't remember the last time Best Picture was actually the movie that I thought was the best. The best football team in the country winning the Super Bowl. Even The Bachelor. It's like the best dating in the whole world. 30 different women compete for the right to marry a sociopath. And I know probably the amount of Alabama Liberal podcast fans and Bachelor viewers, probably if you made a Venn diagram, it would be like a figure 8, like a sideways 8. Probably the two circles barely touch each other. They're definitely not an eclipse. I don't think a lot of people watch The Bachelor and listen to this podcast. Anybody out there who's like, I've always wanted Alabama Liberal to talk about The Bachelor, first of all, who are you? I mean, really, like, who is this one person? But if you've ever wanted that, today's your day, because while watching The Bachelor and the Super Bowl and the Grammys and the Golden Globes and the Oscars and the presidential race, you see a nation that's obsessed with competing. These 30 different women competing to date a sociopath who clearly sucks. The guy this season is a pilot. Most of these women probably make more money than he does. They're better looking, they're younger, they're smarter, way smarter, some of them. And you almost have to wonder, why do they want to date him in the first place? People always say, why do the Bachelor couples not work out long term? Why do they get together on the show and then they break up later on? And I think it's the atmosphere. You get to that show and there's 30 other women competing for a guy. Nothing makes a man seem more eligible than a lot of other women wanting him and being attracted to him. It's a lot better than the reverse, which is most dating sites. Most dating sites is 30 different single men competing for one woman. You don't see a lot of women anymore like actually get on a dating site and meet people and all. Like, it's not even geared towards that. The Match.com commercials and the eHarmony commercials, they used to be like, you will find your soulmate. You will find somebody. Now the dating site's like, you'll have a lot of fun. Doesn't it seem interesting if you sign up and see who you'll meet? You know, just give it a feel, see what happens. Their whole business model is now, we don't even want you to find somebody. We want you to stay on there as long as fucking possible and drain every dollar that we can from you. On The Bachelor, basically you got this guy who sucks, but the women are competing with each other and they're all doing that. And then finally, when it gets down to the one and the man, they have to go off and live a normal life. And that's why it never works out, because the man is used to the mentality of like, hey, 30 different women were willing to put on bra and panties and pillow fight each other just to go out with me. And then he has to come in and be like a normal dude. And they're not kissing his ass all the time. It's like a normal relationship and a normal dynamic, which is very hard to go from being treated like a pharaoh back in ancient Egypt with all these women competing for you and aware that they're competing for you. And then for the women also it sucks, because then the atmosphere's gone and it's like the 15 different girls named Kelly that are competing for this guy, they're all gone, and then you're just stuck with him, and it's like, well, wait a minute. Why did I want him so bad in the first place? So I think it falls apart upon further inspection, and that's why so few of them have gotten together. But in that moment, it's like, I want to be considered the best dater in America, the best state in America, because it's all broadcast across all the nation. Probably thousands of women audition for The Bachelor, and probably most of it is because they've got an Instagram feed and they want to bump up an Instagram, or they're trying to sell something, or be like, he's so dreamy. He almost reminds me of my skincare lotion line, which you can buy. Like, it's the home shopping network, basically, that they're trying to backdoor these ads in. But if they can win and they can compete against all these different women on a national television show, that's kind of like saying you're the most desirable woman in America, because you just get the most desirable man in America, at least until next year when there's somebody else who probably sucks even worse. I think Americans are used to the competition aspect. I think you see it all over the place in movies. I write a lot of movie and TV items, an Alabama liberal, right? Probably as much about movies and TV as I do about politics. And I've seen all the nominated movies, which I don't think a lot of Academy voters have. I live in Los Angeles now, so I meet a lot of people in the TV and film business, and it's almost incredible sometimes to meet people, and they'll be like, I really think Moonlight deserves to win. And I'll be like, oh, you saw Moonlight? No, I haven't seen it, but I think it's an important movie. I guess maybe because it's an all-black cast. That's another thing that's funny, too. People being like, oh, Parasite. I'm glad that a diverse nominee finally won. The entire cast being the same race is not necessarily diverse. Parasite is 100% Korean actors. I don't necessarily consider that to be a lot of diversity. I guess because it's never won before, you could consider it that way. I think a lot of people voted for it that probably had not seen it. You have other things like The Irishman and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and The Joker, 1917, and they're all splitting a lot of the same votes. And then that allows something like Parasite to come through, which is very similar to what Bernie Sanders is doing with the Democratic Party. See, I told you, you're probably sitting there thinking like, okay, he's talking about The Bachelor and fucking movies, and he's going around the world. Where's he going to get to what we care about? So right now, you've got Michael Doomberg, as I call him. You've got Amy Klobutchar. You've got Tulsi Goobard or Ruski Gabbard, whichever you prefer. You've got Elizabeth Warren. You've got Tom Steyer. He's so boring I can't even come up with a nickname for him. Tom Stade, I guess. Tom Stagnant. And Bernie Sunkers. And basically none of these people can win and become the next president. But their fans are so caught up in the competition. They're so caught up in this horse race aspect that the media is constantly pushing forward. And it doesn't really matter. A lot of these people can't win. Now, I'm positive that Elizabeth Warren cannot win. I don't think she can win the nomination, and I don't think she can beat Donald Trump. So you have to wonder, why is she still in the race? What is she doing there? Same thing for Amy Klobuchar. I don't know why she's still there either. But because she surged, and I'm putting up quote marks, you can't see me, in New Hampshire, which is I guess what we're calling a third place finish, because she surged in New Hampshire and did a little bit better than people thought she would do, now we're going to have to see her for at least a month as she campaigns and splits more votes. This is important because Klobuchar and Buttigieg and Biden, and even Warren to an extent, a lot of people think, oh, a lot of Warren's votes will go to Bernie. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think Warren is getting a lot of the former Hillary people who want to see a woman in the White House. I think a lot of these people would prefer to vote for Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg if Warren dropped out. I don't think a lot of her votes would go to Bernie Sanders. I think Sanders has got every vote he will ever get right now. I think his fans would take a bullet for him. They're passionate as hell. They're ready. But I don't think that his audience necessarily grows the more the other candidates drop out. I think that's not true for everybody else. I think if Klobuchar and Warren dropped out tomorrow, Biden and Buttigieg would see a lot of benefits from that. If Michael Bloomberg would drop out before he even gets started, Tom Steyer, same thing. So I think the problem is a little bit like Parasite, where you've got Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, The Joker, and Irishman, a lot of the same votes, especially The Irishman and Once Upon a Time in 1917, because they're all kind of going after the older Oscar contingent, and that allows the Parasite hardcore devotees to really push that forward. And that's happening with the moderate wing of the Democratic Party. I saw Amy Klobuchar was on Real Time with Bill Maher last Friday, and he asked her basically point blank, you guys are dividing a lot of the same votes, and that's allowing Bernie Sanders to have a pretty much unobstructed path to the nomination. The Nevada caucus will probably unfold the same way, with Bernie winning every single vote he would get, whereas if at least 3 of the moderates would drop out, they could consolidate that block vote and probably beat him. And she sort of dismissed it. She really didn't want to talk about it, shut it down and everything. And I'm like, this is very similar to what happened in 2016 with Trump. The Republican nominees, it took them too long for them to drop out and consolidate that vote. Trump would have lost that nomination if Jeb Bush hadn't have gone until South Carolina and had to lose a ton of money that he could have raised and put to somebody else. Chris Christie, I would say Marco Rubio. A lot of different people, they all wanted to beat Trump, but they couldn't agree on who was the one to beat Trump. So you had all these long shots like Ben Carson and Carly Fiorina, and then people that thought they had a good chance but never really did, like Chris Christie and Jeb Bush, and then Rubio, who was a huge flop. And probably the only two people that could have beat Trump was John Kasich and Ted Cruz, but they weren't totally popular with different wings of the party. I mean, a lot of people don't like Ted Cruz, and a lot of the harder core conservatives don't like John Kasich. They think he's a rhino. Basically, it took them so long to finally drop out. Rubio had to lose his home state before he finally dropped out, and by that point, Trump has amassed enough delegates. He's got too much momentum, and they can't catch up with him. And I'm afraid that the exact same thing is happening in 2020 on the Democratic side. Everybody wants to be the guy to take on Trump, but they got to get around Bernie Sanders to do it, and nobody's realizing that while they're fucking around and dividing votes and everything else, he's accumulating more and more wins and more delegates. If he wins Nevada, that's the first 3 states in a row. You could say he either tied Buttigieg or won outright, and at that point it looks like the momentum is with him, because you look at the Midwest, Klobutchar and Buttigieg are going to split a lot of those states, a lot of those votes. He does very well in the Midwest. You look at the Southeast, Tom Steyer and Bloomberg are draining support from Joe Biden. This should be Joe Biden's easiest wins. They're draining support from him to do that. The West Coast, Bernie will probably dominate that just like he did 2016, because there's a lot of people that are pretty amenable to his spiel. It's looking more and more like this extremely divided primary. There's still 8 candidates running, even though Andrew Yang and Michael Bennet and Deval Patrick, oh my God, I forgot how forgettable Patrick is. But even though you have those 3 that have dropped out, there's still 8 candidates running. Ruski Goobard, who has the worst chance of being the nominee, and I think she's only still running because it helps her when she decides to declare a third party. Or the nightmare scenario, the one that I'm the most afraid of, which is that Bernie Sanders will win the nomination and pick her as his running mate. If Bernie Sanders picks Tulsi Gabbard as his running mate, I will not vote for Bernie Sanders, because the nightmare scenario is he becomes the nominee, she's his running mate. By some weird stroke of luck, he happens to win the presidency, dies very early into his first term. He's already had one heart attack, and the stress of running is clearly killing him. I mean, if you just look at him, you can tell he's not in great shape. Dies very early into his first term, perhaps 6 months to a year into it. Then she becomes the president, and then you have both political parties entirely beholden to Russia. Both political parties are basically puppets of Vladimir Putin, and then Tulsi Gabbard and Mitch McConnell are bipartisan. I'm putting up quote marks again, you can't see it, but bipartisan, pushing bills through Congress, because they basically want the same thing, which is the dismantling of the Democratic Party and America's role abroad. They don't care about NATO and all that shit. In fact, I think Gabbard probably deplores it. You have her, and even though she has no chance of becoming the actual nominee, she may run as a third party if Joe Biden or Buttigieg or Bloomberg become the nominee, or she might try to tag on as Sanders as running mate and wait and see what happens with that. And that's why she's still running, to keep her name in the conversation and keep raising funds, keep her army of online St. Petersburg trolls out there. Now, before anyone says, well, you know, Hillary Clinton, she accused Gabbard of being a Russian spy, and she has no evidence for that whatsoever. I have evidence of that, because I made a video on YouTube. All these people saying, oh, there's a conspiracy against Gabbard. That's bullshit. All this stuff about she's being stopped, they're rigging it against her and all this. She was never popular to begin with. Why? Because she's not a real progressive on anything. She's horrible on social issues. The most thing she's progressive about is the dismantling of the American military. And that's because she's a fucking puppet for Russia. That's pretty clear and obvious to understand. She went after every single candidate on that debate stage about exclusively militarism and foreign policy and pulling troops out. She doesn't care about any of the other shit, about the healthcare stuff, the domestic policy, the rebuilding the roads and bridges. A lot of people that back Bernie Sanders, they're not necessarily backing him because they hate the military-industrial complex. That's one thing he's talked about. Bernie Sanders has gone after big pharma, private health insurance, telecom companies, internet companies, lobbyists in general, dark money in general, fossil fuels, campaign industrial complex as we know it, and a dozen other things. The military is just one aspect to that. That's Tulsi Gabbard's only aspect. So she's not progressive enough to really explain all this online support for her that she gets. When you interview real people, and when a journalist actually gets off their ass and calls somebody, what do you think? Who are you going to vote for? Who's your first choice, second choice? She does very bad in those polls. She's only in the top 10 now because there's less than 10 candidates, but she's usually dead last or close to it in any of those polls. Never gotten above 1 or 2% support in any poll that I've ever seen when you use real people. At the same time, when you go online, Quora, which is lit up with bullshit bots and trolls. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube comment sections, Yahoo comment sections, on and on and on. Every time you see any video about her or anything like that, it's lit up with support from these untraceable men, almost exclusively men. I don't think I've ever seen even a pretend Tulsi Gabbard fan. Even the Russians are like, hey, we pull a lot of tricks, but a female Tulsi Gabbard fan, that's not realistic. You see these troll army that's not real people, they're bots. So I made a video about her real support in actual polls is never, ever, ever above 1 or 2%. And why would it be? Better known congressmen like Beto O'Rourke, Seth Moulton, Tim Ryan. Tim Ryan challenged Nancy Pelosi for the speakership. All these people got absolutely nowhere. They had to drop out very early on. If Beto O'Rourke can't get money and fame and anywhere in the polls, who the fuck is Tulsi Gabbard, this nobody congresswoman from Hawaii? Hawaii is practically a different planet. It's barely in the United States. It takes like 6 hours just from LAX, its nearest airport. I took a Hawaiian cruise one time. It takes like a week to get out there by boat, all right? Why would this little known, young, unpopular congresswoman, she's so unpopular in her home state of Hawaii, she can't run for re-election. She could, but she would lose. Why would she rise to the top of the Democratic polls and best the former Vice President Joe Biden and a guy who ran 4 years ago with a ton of popular money and votes? When people like Christian Gillibrand, a senator from fucking New York, the third most populous state in the country, Christian Gillibrand couldn't get anywhere and had to drop out. Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, had to drop out. Steve Bullock from Montana, one of the best candidates to run, period, had to drop out. So why would she be doing better than all these people? And so this idea that there was a conspiracy against her was horseshit. I debunked that in a video. I say in the video, her troll army will come after me, that this will be the least popular video I've ever made, that the comments will be exclusively negative. Sure enough, what happens? 11 thumbs downs, only 2 thumbs ups. I've never made a video that unpopular. I've never made a video where 90% of people give it a thumbs down. I've made over 100 videos. That's never happened before. 4 or 5 comments. You're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. The comments claim to be one from America, one from Norway, and one from perhaps Australia. This little known congresswoman, and who's losing the Democratic race by a mile, who's never cracked 1% in American polls. Somehow she's that big that they know we're all over Europe and Australia. I'm just like, this is bullshit. Nobody knows who this woman is in America. My own family doesn't know who she is. I say Tulsi Gabbard, they say who? 99% of Americans don't know her, have never heard of her, but somehow people know her in Norway. She's got fans out there, right? It's all bullshit. You look at the ISP addresses for those comments, they all originate outside the United States. Even the ones that claim to be inside the United States or outside the United States. I can see this. When you have a YouTube channel, you can see the ISP addresses of where those comments are originating from. You can see how they're coming to your videos. None of the comments and clicks were coming from Facebook and Twitter and my website and all the different places I advertise it. It was exclusively within YouTube search, where people have to go into the YouTube search field and then click on videos of Tulsi Gabbard, which means an online troll army is just sitting there looking for any video about Tulsi Gabbard. They found one that clearly exposed a conspiracy that Russia's putting forward that identifies what they're going to do to the video in the fucking video, and then they're arrogant enough to go in and write all these illiterate comments. The comments clearly are by people who do not speak English as a first language, and yet they did it anyway. It's still about putting enough thumbs down on that video that the algorithms will shift away from it, because YouTube at a certain point, if 90% of people hate a video, they're going to stop recommending it because it's almost like a scam at that point. Y'all know when you're trying to find something, you're like, you know what I want to watch? I want to watch Avengers Endgame for free. Let me go to the YouTube search and type in Avengers Endgame full movie. You click on it and the first looks like a real movie and everything, but you notice all those thumbs downs, and that's because it's just a link telling you where to go to some scam website or whatever, and that's why there's so many thumbs downs. So the algorithms will shift away from a video that is that negative. That's the real reason that they're doing it. And they know that even though I've exposed them as a scam, and I know that their comments are not originating within the United States, and it's everything I predicted in the video, if they can convince even one person, it's worth it for the Russians to do that. She has the worst chance of getting the nomination, and yet she won't drop out for her own selfish reasons. She and Bernie have different reasons than the rest of the field, who should drop out, has not dropped out. Michael Bloomberg, or Doomberg as I call him, he would lose the presidency without question. In my mind, people are like, Bloomberg, he's the one. He is an almost 80-year-old billionaire from New York, I think Boston originally, who wants to take America's guns away. Can you see a problem with this? Have you seen the Charlottesville rally, Jews will not replace us? And here comes this guy who's like, all I want to do is bring in a lot of immigrants and get rid of your guns. What's the problem with that? Like, he is Trump on economic issues, by and large. He's not economically progressive, and he's pretty terrible on civil rights. like stop and frisk and things like that. But the two things where he's left on, guns and immigration, Trump's two most popular issues just about. I have no doubt in my mind this guy would lose, but yet at the same time, he can come in and buy his way onto the debate stage, buy delegates, buy support, not compete at all in Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada, be on the ballot for the Super Tuesday states. A lot of the media is being really behind Bloomberg. I think they might want a job, or he has a lot of influence because, again, he owns a media empire. All of the damn QAnon and all these fucking right-wing crazies and their conspiracy theories, what do they believe? That George Soros runs a media empire that is part of the deep state, controls the deep state, and that's how they're trying to get rid of Trump. Here comes along Bloomberg. All I am is a $60 billion Jewish guy from New York who's got a literal media empire and wants to take your guns away and replace you with immigrants. Gee, what could fucking go wrong with that? I don't know. They will inspire his base probably more than Bernie Sanders would in terms of turnout and things like that. All of 2019, people like Kamala Harris are campaigning. They're doing everything the right way. He comes along on a national ad buy, dumps a shitload of money. And Tom Steyer did the same thing, but Bloomberg's is probably a little bit bigger. Dumps hundreds of millions of dollars in TV ads. People like Kamala Harris say he's made the race so expensive, I cannot compete. I have to drop out of the race because I can't afford the ad buys. Joe Biden, has anybody seen a commercial for Joe Biden? I haven't. I live in California, Los Angeles. This is one of the biggest media markets in America. I have not seen a Joe Biden commercial. I mean, maybe Joe Biden thinks March the 3rd he can get a airplane flyer to come out and write a message in the clouds or something. I mean, I don't know, but I've gotten no direct mailers. I've gotten them for Tom Steyer and Bernie Sanders. I've seen ads for Tom Steyer and Bloomberg. If I turn on the TV right now, I'll see a Michael Bloomberg ad. And if not that, Tom Steyer ad. I've seen a few commercials for Bernie Sanders. I've seen nothing for Joe Biden. And people are saying he's running out of cash. He may have to drop out of the race just because he can't compete financially with Bloomberg. This is a disaster. This is a ticking time bomb. This is why I'm calling him Doomberg. All of the Bernie Sanders people who share a lot of the same views as the Trump people in terms of there's a conspiracy, the system's stacked against outsiders, everything's not fair, they're coming to get this and that. They share those fears. And when you have somebody like Bernie Sanders who is not afraid to stoke those fears and literally say Bloomberg is trying to buy the nomination, it actually is trying to buy the nomination. And all these journalists and media types, Bloomberg can do no wrong because they're sucking up to him. He's one of the very few people that owns a literal media empire. A lot of reporters and journalists don't want to piss him off. It would be like going and saying, you know who sucks? Jeff Bezos. They may need a job one day. Amazon Studios may be trying to put together a TV show that they wrote the pilot for, or they may have a freelance article that they want the Washington Post to run. There are a couple of dozen guys who really control the media and have a ton of influence over the media, and they don't want to piss any of these people off. Bloomberg is one of those people. So to watch reporters and different people really suck up to him and kiss his ass is almost nauseating. Bloomberg, he made a zinger. He shot a tweet at Trump, and it really got under Trump's skin. Everybody gets under his skin. Whoever the nominee is will get under his skin. Elizabeth Warren, he calls her Pocahontas. Joe Biden, he calls him Sleepy Joe. Buttigieg gets under his skin about military service when he calls him President Bone Spurs and different things like that. Buttigieg served, Trump didn't. Famously makes him look like a coward. Anybody is going to be able to really get under his skin just about. To see them fawning over every tweet that he launches or things like that, and at the same time, knowing for a fact that he would lose the race if he were the nominee, and also knowing that about the only way he could become the nominee is to go into a brokered convention and buy up enough delegates to emerge as the nominee, which would set the Bernie Sanders people on fire. And to be honest, even though I'm more of a Biden or Buttigieg or Kamala Harris fan, it sets me on fire. I don't want to vote for a nominee that didn't do the campaigning in 2019, didn't do any of the early voting states. Yes, Joe Biden came in 5th in New Hampshire. And probably some people were looking at my podcast and being like, Alabama liberal, he hadn't had a new episode in 2 weeks. He's probably spinning his wheels, trying to desperately to find a way to spin the news as good for Joe Biden that he came in 5th. It wasn't good for Joe Biden. I still do believe that he's more electable than just about anybody else. But at the same time, I have to admit that wasn't a great result in New Hampshire, although I did kind of expect it, and he expected it too. He set people up for that. If you've got all these candidates going out and doing the hard work of campaigning in the early voting states, going to a seemingly endless series of debates, Bloomberg has done no debates. They've already done like 7 or 8. We've seen that same Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders quarrel about health care. You can't pay for it. Joe, you can't afford not to pay for it. I mean, this is like Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau and Grumpy Old Men 3 or something. This is like their ghosts have been resurrected on this primary stage. We've seen a lot of the same debate points over and over again. And then Bloomberg gets come in at the last minute and be fresh and new new and something interesting where all these other candidates have been exhausted. If you've had a long, grueling primary season where Christian Gillibrand and Kamala Harris and Beto O'Rourke and Julian Castro and Cory Booker, they've already had to drop out due to either lack of funds or stagnant juices, campaigns not going the way that they thought it would. And then Bloomberg gets to jump in at the last minute with a shit ton of money after all these other candidates are exhausted. It does look a little bit rigged in his favor. And he's probably buying endorsements, pay for certain delegates or things like that, people that should be voting for who their state voted for, but will flip to him easily because a lot of these people will be like, oh, a new Ferrari from an anonymous donor. I don't know who this is. I guess I better vote for Bloomberg. There are a lot of things that aren't fair that he's doing, skipping the debates, the early voting states, on. And I don't like that as somebody who wanted to vote for Kamala Harris but felt like he priced her out of the race because she all but said that. You have Tom Steyer doing the same goddamn thing, but to a less successful extent. Tom Steyer has no chance of being the Democratic nominee. But what is he doing? The last debate, he was like a crazy man up there on stage. He was hitting Joe Biden on every fucking point. He was going after Buttigieg. He was throwing elbows and knees. And he was like, no one on this stage has done what I have done for climate crisis. No one on this stage has done what I have done. I thought, you've never been in fucking politics. You've never held elected office. You've never done shit but write a big fucking check. Writing a check to Gavin Newsom's gubernatorial campaign and then taking credit when he wants to introduce a government version of prescription drugs is bullshit. I mean, this is the same kind of rich guy thinking that drives people nuts. Well, I saw the need for net neutrality, which is why I put $50,000 in a super PAC that was for net neutrality. I've done more than anyone else on this stage in terms of that issue. It still gets back to the idea that you can pay your way to influence, that you can buy power, and that fucking pisses people off in the Democratic Party. But what he's doing, instead of dropping out, is spending a shit ton of money and making it to where somebody like Biden or Buttigieg, whose campaigns don't have that kind of cash, are really struggling to advertise and compete. And all he's going to do, he'll siphon away Biden's support in Nevada, let Bernie Sanders win that caucus. He'll siphon it away in South Carolina, possibly cost Biden, if he doesn't win South Carolina, a lot of people say he should quit the race and he's finished. If Tom Steyer does that to him, I will forever hate Tom Steyer. These candidates are costing people that are infinitely more electable than they are. Nobody wants to vote for a guy like Steyer. It would be the ultimate hypocrisy to say, well, Donald Trump never held elected office. He's a billionaire president who bought his way into the Oval Office, and he's terrible, and he sucks, and he doesn't know what he's doing, and he's incompetent. You know who else we should get? Another guy who's never held elected office and has a lot of money and thinks he knows everything, like Tom Steyer. That would be the definition of hypocrisy. He has to know on some level that he can't win and be the nominee, and yet he's hitting these people as hard as he possibly can, severely wounding them so that the Bernie Sanders wing can rise up and take the nomination. Then you have Klobutchar, who, as I said, has already been asked, really, what is your long-term strategy? How can you win this nomination? Doesn't have one. For a long time, it looked like her big play was to become Joe Biden's running mate. That's what she was really doing. She was a stalking horse for Biden. Because if you notice on the debate stage, she's never run after him. She's gone after Elizabeth Warren. She's gone after Bernie Sanders. She's gone after Pete Buttigieg multiple times. She thinks he's like this little Opie Taylor, fucking little kid who doesn't know what he's doing. Has gone after everybody but Joe Biden. And I thought kind of the plan was she'll be a stalking horse for him. A lot of his closest aides probably don't believe that he should be hitting people hard or necessarily getting into elbows or that he can do that. Keep in mind, Biden is still fighting back a stutter, and yet at the same time, Biden is a great debater. So I don't know all these people being like, well, Joe Biden, I don't know if he can go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump. He mopped the fucking floor with Sarah Palin in 2008 and Paul Ryan in 2012. People will be like, well, so what? Anybody could beat Sarah Palin in a debate. But Paul Ryan, the motherfucker is the Speaker of the House. He's one of their brightest, sharpest Congress people, or so that he was sold to the American people as. He mopped the floor with these two people. I feel like he's holding back. I think that he wants to play the feeble old man, and then finally if Trump agrees to a debate with him, because keep in mind, all these people being like, we want to see who can go to a debate with Donald Trump. Trump may not go to the debate. He's floated the idea multiple times that unless he gets his way, he's not going to show up for the presidential debates. But if he thinks Joe Biden is a feeble old man with a stutter that he can mop the floor with, and not the Joe Biden from the vice presidential debates, he might show up for that, and then boom, Biden comes out of nowhere and wallops him. But I think in the primary debates, Biden can't really do that for multiple different reasons. That Klobuchar was his stalking horse. She would go out there and do this stuff, and maybe the agreement is if Biden's the nominee, she'll be VP. I think that's more what she's suited to do than becoming president. I don't think Klobuchar would be a very good president. Really think she's cut out for that. I think vice president, all they really do is help get a couple of extra states in the Electoral College, and obviously Minnesota. They really need Wisconsin. Some of West western Wisconsin shares the same media markets as Minneapolis, and some of northern Iowa shares the same as Minneapolis. But at the same time, I'm worried as to why she did so bad in Iowa. She came in 5th. This is a state that neighbors Minnesota. You'd think she would do very well there, and she didn't. I really don't think she has any chance of being the nominee. And we'll know if Klobutchar is totally full of shit, and if she has better instincts than Warren, if in the next upcoming debate she hits Joe Biden. If she hits Joe Biden and goes after him, she's dead to me. Her whole strategy is seeming to be to leave Biden alone, and if she starts thinking she can win and become the nominee outright and doesn't need to settle for VP, she may directly go after Joe Biden, attack him, and rip him down to size. All she'll be doing is guaranteeing that the nominee is Bernie or Buttigieg or Bloomberg, and I don't think any of them will pick her as VP. I know Bernie won't, and I don't think Buttigieg will because she's insulted him about 15 different times. People tend to like a running mate who doesn't think they're a fucking moron and unqualified for the job. That's typically how people think about those decisions. And Bloomberg, God only knows who he'd pick as a running mate, probably a mirror so he can look in his reflection. It's just one of those things where I do believe she doesn't really have the right instincts to take down somebody like Trump. I don't think she can beat him. I don't personally like her. I lived in Minnesota. I lived in Minneapolis. As my senator, she was not very interesting to me personally. I always preferred Al Franken. She doesn't fill me with any real enthusiasm. People always say, well, I like Joe Biden. I think he could beat Trump, but I don't necessarily like his ideas. Klobuchar's ideas are no ideas. I mean, her whole thing is Elizabeth Warren can't do what she says she can do. She's tearing down all these different candidates and their ideas and saying stuff about them. We don't need to take moonshots, pie in the sky, this and that. This is exactly what Hillary did in 2016, and it made people feel like they had no real reason to vote for her. There was no inspiration. Elizabeth Warren has the opposite problem of Klobuchar, and yet the same problem of Klobuchar. Just like Amy didn't win Iowa, even though she should have because it shares a lot of the media markets that Minneapolis does, Elizabeth Warren lost badly in New Hampshire, and it neighbors Massachusetts. There's part of New Hampshire that gets their news from Boston. So they definitely knew who Elizabeth Warren was. When you have people that know you the best and they don't vote for you, that's saying something. And by the way, other than Bloomberg, Warren is really the only one I'm confident would lose to Donald Trump. I think Elizabeth Warren would lose to Trump by the biggest margin. I think Tom Steyer is very doubtful, very, very, very doubtful to beat someone like Donald Trump. I also believe Bernie Sanders is doubtful to beat Donald Trump. But Elizabeth Warren, it's hard to say why she won't drop out. I really don't know what her thinking is going forward. She kind of reminds me, I had a teacher who liked to hear herself talk. And I mean, sometimes it had absolutely nothing to do. She would start talking about how if we didn't do our homework and we didn't do well on the test, it was our parents' fault. It had nothing to do with what we were talking with or necessarily doing about. Sometimes we'd be sitting there ready to learn and listen. And she would go off on a side tangent about how our parents are failing us by not making us do more schoolwork, even though we're there, pencils ready. Warren is a little bit like that. She kind of has that pedantic streak, and she's always talking about herself as a school teacher. I know she was a school teacher at one time, although a professor at Harvard University Law School is not really my idea of a school teacher necessarily in terms of, it's a very different experience. But she has a very pedantic way of kind of talking to people and always insisting on these purity tests. As I said in the previous episode, I believe she has bad instincts. I think she sets up something like Buttigieg has fundraisers in wine caves, and then they show where she had one in that same wine cave not 2 years ago for a Senate campaign. I think that's the problem with somebody who didn't become a Democrat until late middle age. Elizabeth Warren didn't become a Democrat until she was 50 years old. Now, I've heard of people say, well, Hillary Clinton was a Goldwater girl. She was for Barry Goldwater in college. In college is a little different than when you're 50 years old. I mean, you should have had a come to Jesus meeting about your politics a lot earlier than that. It's not that hard to see that they're full of shit the second you get out of that college bubble or whatever and start paying for stuff and being responsible for your own expenses. I'm very skeptical of people who come to the Democratic Party so late in life and benefit from that in some kind of way. She's always been so ideologically pure and rigid and inflexible, and according to a lot of different sources, Hillary Clinton wanted her to run her cabinet past her, and she would discourage her from picking anybody who was remotely connected to the Obama economics team. Like Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, Hillary was thinking about her for Treasury Secretary, and Warren made it clear she would block her because Sheryl Sandberg used to work for Larry Summers, was like a deputy to him or something when he was the Treasury Secretary. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, but fuck off. When somebody runs for president and they become the president and they become the nominee, it's their cabinet, and they get to pick that. They went through the gauntlet, and you didn't. Now you're going through the gauntlet. Nobody wants you. They've told you multiple times in different states. You have no path coming up. None of the Super Tuesday states, other than her home state of Massachusetts, have her winning any of those. She's definitely not going to win Nevada or South Carolina. So her path going forward is non-existent, and yet she's still trying to set the tone and set the debate. And that just feels like kind of a very controlling tendency that I see with her sometimes, where she's trying to micromanage a lot of different things that really kind of not her responsibility to do that. Even in 2016, Hillary Clinton had to drag out this long-ass race with Bernie Sanders because he refused to quit and endorse her, so it went on for several months more than it should have. But he finally does the right thing. He endorses her. Barack Obama endorses her. Why did Elizabeth Warren wait until after the nomination was completely over? It almost sucked the oxygen out of the room. She's got Obama, the sitting president's endorsement. Elizabeth Warren comes in the mind too. You know, it didn't look totally sincere. It didn't look like something she wanted to do. Why is War Ruin still running? I think in her mind, she's convinced herself that she can still be the nominee, that she can turn it around because she doesn't really have affinity for listening to other people. I've seen her be interviewed. I'm not a casual observer of this. Like, I'm watching interviews, I'm watching debates, I'm watching town halls, I'm watching Elizabeth Warren go before the New York Times editorial board, and they're asking her questions, and she's barely listening to a word they say before she can get out her 4 or 5 different focus points. And then they still turn around and endorse her, which made no real sense considering if you watched her interview and how poorly she did. But Elizabeth, how can you get this past Mitch McConnell? Let me tell you what we need to focus on. I have 3 brothers. Only one of them is a Democrat. 2 of them are Republicans, and they're voting for me. Well, that's great, Elizabeth. Like, we're worried about your electability, and as long as people are relatives of yours, as long as they are immediate family members, you can win over Republicans. That's great. Just a quick aside, I also noticed that Klobutchar, when she was on Real Time, Bill Maher asked her something, and she trotted out that same lame-ass joke when Trump called her Snow Woman, and she declared in a blizzard, and she says, I'd like to see how your hair survives in a blizzard. Trevor Noah, I thought, would have ended that joke because he cut together a montage of her using that probably dozens of times, close to 100 times, where she told the same fucking joke over and over again. She still tried to that out on Real Time, as though he had not already demolished the effectiveness of this joke. And I think you're seeing a lot of these candidates that just go into their talking points. You ask them these questions, and Klobutchar will tell a joke that has almost nothing to do. Elizabeth Warren will do the same thing. You're seeing a lot of these candidates come off as very stiff, very robotic, very much the kind of things that don't work. I've seen Joe Biden actually answer people's questions when they ask him things, and him actually give detailed, nuanced answers. I do feel like he's the least scripted. That ability to be able to think on the fly. I know people like to question how nimble his mind is. According to them, he's lost half his faculties, he's lost his marbles. And yet I've seen Warren and Klobuchar and Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders all give almost identical answers to separate questions that have clearly nothing to do with what they're being asked. And so, of course, that brings me to the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Bernie Sunkers, and the fact that Trump very, very clearly wants to run against him. It could not be more obvious that this is who Trump wants to run against. When you ask Bernie's fans this, like Michael Moore was on Seth Meyers, and Seth Meyers says, it seems to be that he wants to run against Bernie Sanders. He's afraid of Bernie Sanders. That's why he never says anything bad about him. He's afraid of Bernie Sanders. Yes, an 80-year-old socialist with no support whatsoever from American industries, but an army of Facebook fans. Yes, he is afraid of Bernie Sanders. Give me a fucking break. The fact that you have Don Jr. and a lot of Trump surrogates putting forth the conspiracy theory that the Iowa caucus was rigged against Bernie, that the DNC's trying to screw him, because in their minds they think either one, Bernie will not be the nominee because the DNC will come to their senses, and if it goes to a broker convention, there's no way Bernie Sanders is going to be the nominee. Well, why not? Why not? When you've refused to be a part of a political party for decades, terrible things about Democrats for decades. He said 20 years ago, it would be hypocritical of me to run as a Democrat considering what I've said about the Democratic Party. Yes, Bernie, I agree with you. It is hypocritical. When you've dissed a political party and refused to belong to them for decades, it's kind of hard for them to say, you know who we should give the nomination to? The guy who's shat on us for 50 years. 2016, he runs as a Democrat, even though he's never wanted to be one before. 2018, he goes back to being an independent. Then in 2020, he comes back as a Democrat, and everybody's being like, so what? So what? If he's not going to be a Democrat when he doesn't need them, like when he's running for the Senate race, how can he be one when he does as president and yet somehow endear himself to the party? He keeps saying that it's rigged against him, even as he gets preferential treatment. Nobody else is able to do this, flip back and forth, like I'm a Democrat when I need to be for the presidential race, but I'm independent when I don't need to be for my Senate race. I'm going to run as an independent between my two presidential runs, and then I'm going to tell Tom Perez, oh, here's the new things that I want to see for the Democratic Party. I want to see restrictions on superdelegates. I want to see this. I want to see that. He's able to set terms and conditions. Nobody else is allowed to do this. This is preferential treatment very clearly, and yet in his fans' mind, it's rigged against him. He can't catch a break. This is bad for Bernie. So the reason that Trumps are supporting this conspiracy theory is because they know that eventually Bernie is either going to get screwed out of the nomination, or so his fans will believe, or if he is the nominee, they'll beat him in a walk. They believe this, clearly. His fans are like, well, that's just because they think that all you got to do is call somebody a socialist and people won't vote for him. Okay, but where's your counter argument that that doesn't work? Because the last time that we had very liberal candidates, Adlai Stevenson got beat by Eisenhower hugely. 2 different races back in the 50s. George McGovern lost pretty bad. Walter Mondale lost pretty bad. I think the most liberal presidential candidate in my lifetime was John Kerry. And he's the only one who's lost the popular vote. In my lifetime, we've seen the Clintons and the Obamas, Hillary and Al Gore. I do think John Kerry is probably to the left of most of those people that I just named. And he's the only one who lost the popular vote against Bush, an incumbent president who was kind of a moron. It does seem to be that there is no real data Trumpers think about socialism not being popular with the majority of Americans isn't true. With Bernie Sanders, you almost have to pray that there's a recession between now and November. If there's no recession between now and November, he loses the race. I think it's impossible for Elizabeth Warren and Bloomberg to win. I think it's very, very doubtful for Steyer and Amy Klobuchar to win. I don't think it's impossible for Bernie Sanders to win, but you almost have to hope for a massive recession and that people will vote him in. I believe FDR benefited from the Great Depression taking place, otherwise he may have never won before. Even if there's an international crisis, it doesn't benefit Bernie. That sometimes helps Democrats if there was a major international fuck-up, because Bernie Sanders, clearly the military and foreign policy is not his strong suit. So a lot of people don't turn into that. To voters that care about foreign policy, they almost always go with Buttigieg or Biden. So he can't even have that necessarily to fall back on. He has to basically hope that the economy tanks, and it does so in such a way that he can clearly point to people turning to socialism, which they're more likely to turn to somebody like Bloomberg, who they feel like actually knows more about the economy than Trump does. It could even backfire on him to have a recession, because people might say, well, the problem with Trump is that he was an idiot businessman. He presented himself as this master deal maker, but he inherited $400 million. He said it was $1 million. It was $400 million that the New York Times discovered. And if he left that money in a blind investment account, he would be worth substantially more money today than he's actually worth. Got sued 3,500 times in civil court. He had all these bankruptcies. He's been divorced twice. They look at him as being kind of an idiot when it comes to business. If they were really looking under the hood, they would say, well, Bloomberg probably is actually closer to a true businessman, and they might turn to him versus somebody like Sanders, who they may feel like, well, he talks and talks and talks about these issues for decades. He's had the same 5 ideas since he was a teenager. Bernie Sanders' answers today are the same as they were when JFK was president. The Eisenhower JFK days, Bernie Sanders has been talking about the same shit. And it seems to be more relevant today, but it doesn't mean that he's necessarily learned more about the economy in all those decades. So you have the Trump team who clearly wants to run against Bernie Sanders, and they are clearly afraid of Joe Biden. Trump broke the law to go to Ukraine and China to ask for blackmail about Joe Biden. He has not done that for anybody else. This is clearly who he does not want to run against. Sanders is clearly who he does want to run against. So you have to wonder why that is. Donald Trump is a lot of things, and a sociopath is very good at survival. They have instincts that you can't teach. Self-preservation is something Trump is very good at. He is a political animal. He has instincts like a political animal. And he looks at Bernie and he says, once you get past the ideology, people in primaries are focused on ideology and specific issues. When you get to a general election, you draw in what's called your low information voters. This is the majority of your swing voters. What do they vote on? Personality. I want to have a beer with Bush, and I think Gore is stiff. I want to have a beer with Bush, but I think John Kerry is a snob. I think Mitt Romney is a snob. You see this come up over and over again. Hillary Clinton has a bad personality. Trump, he may be crazy, but he says what he thinks. He has fun. Personality plays a huge role in that. Once you get past Bernie Sanders' ideology, you realize that he is a grumpy, charmless old fuck. It's almost surreal how little true charisma he actually has. And a lot of people vote on that stuff. He acts like it doesn't matter. When I watched him interview for the endorsement of the New York Times editorial board on that show, The Weekly, he's like, I've been surprised that so many people respond to backslapping and smiles and personality. That's not me. That's never been me. That is a huge fucking problem. And he just inadvertently admitted a huge problem that he has, which is his own personality. I don't think a lot of low information voters are necessarily going to be like, hey, that 80-year-old guy who looks like he's always in a bad mood and just had a heart attack and his hair's a mess and is grumpy as hell and acts like he doesn't want to be there. Tell me more about that guy. He looks like a loser just in terms of how Trump likes to judge these things. Trump doesn't want to run against somebody like Buttigieg, who is clearly in better shape, can spring around the debate stage. Bernie can attack Trump on his physicality because he's also in bad shape. He can't really get the personality aspect across. The entire business class of the country will be against Bernie Sanders. That always makes me laugh, is when you have his fans and the Bernie fans are saying, we need Bernie Sanders because the business class of this country has too much power and they've got the game rigged and it's all stacked in their favor. That's true. What they're saying is 100% right. But if you know that and you believe that, how in the hell can Bernie Sanders win? Like, they've got so much power that they control everything, but they're going to let a socialist waltz into the White House unimpeded with no problem. That doesn't make sense. That's a psychological hole that you could drive a truck through. Even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's like his biggest cheerleader in the Congress, who's kind of like him in that she doesn't want to pay her dues, but wants all the advantages of telling the Democratic Party what to do and how to do it and when to do it, but doesn't want to pay her Democratic membership dues. Even she's like, well, Bernie, he can't make health care single-handedly. He can't wave a magic wand and do Medicare for all and ban private insurance. Even she is setting expectations lower. Bernie's one big issue most of the country is with him on is health care, and even she is admitting that he's going to have a hard time doing stuff. I think this is why a lot of these candidates are spoilers. I think they're going to reelect probably the worst president in history. If Trump is not the worst president, because this is President's Day, and I see a lot of these different articles about who's the best president of all time, who's the worst president of all time. A lot of them are real biased. When you look at a list of the worst presidents of all time and you see like LBJ and Jimmy Carter, you know a Republican wrote that. There's no fucking way, objectively speaking, LBJ and Jimmy Carter are in the worst presidents of all time, top 5. There's no way that you can put them in there. The actual worst presidents of all time, I think Trump has got to be in the top 5. Bottom 5, I guess I should say. I also believe George W. Bush would be in the bottom 5. I think Nixon would be close to the bottom 5. All these different conversations about Trump being the worst president of all time, and yet at the same time could be reelected if the Democrats go about their current strategy of 7 major candidates, all cannibalizing votes, all sucking up dollars. It's a blood feud for the nomination. It's 3 solid months of burning cash, exhausting yourself, having competitive debates where each individual candidate is getting dented and dinged and all this shit while Trump runs largely unimpeded. He practically shut down the Republican primary. There's about 10 states where there is no Republican primary because he's that worried that some idiot like Joe Walsh, a sitting president, should not be afraid of a disgraced ex-congressman who was sued for child support like Joe Walsh. This should not keep a sitting president up at night, but Trump is so insecure he shuts down the primary because he's afraid if Joe Walsh gets 2% of a single state, it'll make him look vulnerable. And they've all studied that typically incumbent presidents who have a very well-funded or even slight opposition typically lose. So he shut down the Republican primary, and meanwhile he's gathering $1 billion, amassing a fortune. Bloomberg and Steyer, what they should be doing is putting all their resources that they've already spent for themselves behind Joe Biden or Buttigieg to win the nomination, and then when one of them gets the nomination, all the way to November. That's the only real chance, instead of saying, I don't want to be a Manchurian candidate and I want to run myself. That is the fundamental misreading of what the American public wants. I hate all these articles that have been like, well, Bloomberg, he's actually running himself and paying for it, and America's much more comfortable with that than a billionaire George Soros type pulling the strings of a Buttigieg. Nobody gives a shit. I mean, people said that about Trump. That was the argument for Trump. Like, oh, we need him because he can't be bought and paid for, and he's completely bought and paid for. The argument is that people are disconnected from what working people are going through, and I don't see how putting an actual billionaire like Bloomberg at the top of a ticket is signaling to people, we know what you're going through. I think a lot of people are struggling to buy their third beach house, right? Am I right, guys? Like, he doesn't fucking have a clue. But it's being put forth that somehow it's more noble to have a billionaire doing it himself than funding somebody else who at least comes from a working class background. Buttigieg honestly has some of the best ideas in the entire race. They're progressive. They're more feasible than Warren's or Sanders. They're more specific than Warren's and Sanders. A lot of times, Bernie Sanders feels like he has yesterday's solutions for tomorrow's problems. I mean, he goes back to the 1930s for most of his ideas. Buttigieg, he's the least wealthy of all the candidates. I think he joined the military to pay down his student loan debt. Yes, a billionaire is going to have to fund him to get him past Trump, but at least he's taking the knowledge of what it's actually like for working class people on the ground and using that versus somebody who hasn't experienced that for 20 years. So no, I don't think it's a quaint relief to have an actual billionaire versus a billionaire funding a working class guy. That's bullshit. It's the same outcome except probably worse, because they're only going to advocate for policies like tax cuts that benefit them. That's what they care about. When he was mayor of New York City, his inner circle cared about getting rid of rent control and zoning regulations and taking caps off of Wall Street, and that's how he governed it. He was not an economically progressive mayor at all. And so I'm having a hard time believing, just like I don't totally believe Elizabeth Warren suddenly becomes a Democrat at 50 years old, or Bernie Sanders decides that now he's a Democrat when he wants to be president, or Michael Bloomberg decides, oh, you know what, I'm 78 years old and I've come to Jesus on progressive economics. Now I understand how bad it is for poor people out there when he didn't govern that way a very short time period ago. No, I don't totally believe that that's sincere, and all it's doing is costing probably the only two candidates who could beat Donald Trump. Buttigieg is a coin toss. I'm not saying he can beat him, but I'm saying he'll come closer than the ones I've spent this whole episode tearing apart. And Biden, I think, is also a little bit better than a coin toss and a lot better chance of winning the Senate seats, which we'll talk about that in a different episode. But there's going to be another episode coming up pretty shortly because, the race is really kicking into gear and we need all the episodes we can get. Super Tuesday is March the 3rd. Thanks for listening, everybody.